We're now going to hear from Graham Thomas on the need to keep design quality on the radar during times of intense growth, and also from Peter Dawson, who's going to discuss Essex Design Guide's case studies and bringing new areas of work to within the sphere. We're short of time, so I'm just going to hand straight over to you.
Many years ago, I was an undergraduate at the planning school here, so it's great to be invited back. So as introduction says, that Peter and I are going to take us through growth and also some case studies in relation to the Essex Design Guide. So is it too much to ask in a pro-growth county that we deliver increased pace in terms of housing, but also address the quality of design whilst we create fantastic and great places? I think not. I think that's really what, as town planners, that's really what we are being asked to do at this particular point. So back in 2016, so if we take ourselves back, before we had a good football team, we started off as local authorities realising that actually, having come out of a very unsuccessful period of trying to sort of land devolution, what we didn't know at that particular time was the scale of growth planned for within Essex. And what we wanted to do was understand what that looked like, what the infrastructure costs would be, what the distribution would be. And we also knew that we didn't know the answers to the question of what was the infrastructure costs associated with the scale of growth, and therefore what the gap of funding was. So we had several reasons why we collectively came together as 15 local authorities to commence this piece of work. So the Growth and Infrastructure Framework, which was undertaken in 2016, gave us a fantastic view in relation to where the growth patterns, the spatial distribution of growth would occur within Essex. Clearly, we've got the M11 corridor along the west of Essex around Harlow and going up through London to Stansted. We've got the A12 corridor leading from London right the way through to Ipswich and further to the north. Then we've got another corridor which going across the north of the county, where a number of you are probably aware we've got a series of garden communities. And likewise, in relation to the south of the county, we've got a whole series of strategic growth, of which Kirsty's given us a very good picture in relation to the Thurrock picture, but there's actually 6 local authorities that are coming together in terms of the joint strategic plan there. So we've got the A127 and the A13. So that's probably an easier one to pick up in terms of the key growth corridors that we identified through the Growth and Infrastructure Framework. So having spent an awful long time actually working with all of the local authorities, all of the utility companies, health particularly, and a whole range of other sort of external inputs, we identified that we had a growth aspiration back in 2016, so this is before the MHCLG new housing figures, which have probably taken that to over 200,000. We had an aspiration to deliver 180,000 new homes, which is a huge quantity of new homes. And obviously that would increase the population by almost 300,000. The interesting statistic around that is in relation to the costs. So the infrastructure costs of that growth were £4.4 billion. But the big thing, one of the big questions that we wanted to understand is where is that gap funding? How much can we afford from all the different sources, and what is the gap? And the gap turned out to be just a little bit over 4.4 billion. Part of that is in relation to, if you like, the lack of developer-funded contributions. We've heard a lot about concerns about sort of lack of developer funding in infrastructure contributions. And that, so basically that means that we are securing something about £7,500 per new home built in Essex at the current time for infrastructure contribution, but we need to shift that balance to broadly about 35,000. So it's a really, really big ask. So we've got all of this discussion going on in 2016, all this work in terms of how we deliver growth, where the infrastructure is. Another role that I play is I'm chair of the Essex Planning Officers Association. So again, back in 2016, the focus was just so much on, and we've heard this several times, it was housing, 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 whether you're in DM or whether you're producing your local plan. The conversation was completely dominated by that. And as planning heads of service and planning directors, we said, hang on a minute, actually, let's remember the old phraseology of the Mars bar, and I know a number of you will probably remember the work, rest and play. Well, that's completely what planning is about. It's about jobs, it's about homes, it's about environment. And we needed to reboot that conversation. So it wasn't just housing dominated, because there's a lot more to planning and delivering great places than just houses. So 2016, the Essex Planning Officers Association, and again we've heard a little bit about this, is there were two areas of activity that we wanted to really embed a lot stronger. One was around the quality agenda, the design and quality agenda, and secondly also recognising that perhaps local authorities needed to build stronger and better relationships with house builders, promoters, master builders. And we identified three things that we wanted to develop in relation to each of those. And whilst they're both up there before you in terms of the relationship, in terms of the framework with the developers, the focus today really is on the quality agenda. And so we had that conversation around how do we take that forward in terms of how do we shift the balance, sort of making it easier for our members, making it easier for ourselves in relation to developers. What do we need to do to take back control a little bit? And it's fantastic because there's sort of the thinking going on in government at this time. So if we think back to 2016, all that we're talking about in terms of design quality, it wasn't really the topic of the day. So we had to sort of take back control a little bit in terms of that thinking. So the design guide was thought about, it's quite old now, the Essex Design Guide was in 2005 at that particular time. So we thought, well, that was great, that's going to be helpful. But we also looked across the field and said, well, Cambridgeshire are doing something in relation to a quality charter. You know, other locations, how do we embed that? And then finally, let's think about sort of how we help local authorities and planning committees in terms of that quality panel. So why do we need a new Essex Design Guide? Well, linking us back to that growth agenda, we had huge amounts of growth. One of the things that we wanted to do was to absolutely make sure that growth was of a decent quality, or a good quality, should I say, not decent quality. The other thing, again, certainly the local authority officers were aware, and no doubt sort of elected members, is constantly we've had that pushback. So whilst Essex is a pro-growth county, there are communities within Essex where there are real concerns because infrastructure is not being provided, services are being put upon, and the quality of what is being built is not good enough. And clearly, having worked with the building research establishment, so one of the interesting points that came out of that is every new house, on average, has got about £5,000 worth of snagging defects. So you move into a new home, and you've instantly got £5,000 worth of problems to sort out. That is not really a fantastic market, is it? And if you talk to some of the quality house builders, they operate at really low margins. So if you take them out of the equation, some house builders and some developers are creating huge problems to create that average of £5,000. So if we're going to be pro-growth, quality, services, infrastructure are absolutely essential. So that was one of the factors that we really pushed us in relation to the design guide. Historically, the Essex Design Guide also was perhaps a little bit twee. And one of the things that we had a conversation with ourselves is it needs to reflect different places. So Thurrock is different, Basildon is different. Not everything looks like a sort of a chocolate box village. And we needed the new design guide to actually embrace places, to be relevant to everywhere that exists within our locality. Quality matters. We know that the difference between good quality development and poor quality development can make a huge difference in terms of price. I've heard figures of around sort of, we build it right, we get the quality right, it can actually add premiums of about 20%. And no doubt there's people in the room that can tell me that it can uplift even more than that. Obviously, we were aware since 2005 huge amounts of difference. So in days gone by, we had things called regional plans. We've moved over to the MPPF as it was then, or the new version that's just about to emerge. The other thing was we were very aware that rather than produce a paper-based plan, how do we use new technology? And one of the thought processes that sat behind that was we wanted an online Essex Design Guide. Now, we looked everywhere and we couldn't find somebody who'd done this before, so we still think that we've got the first online interactive design guide in the world, but please challenge me and tell me if you know different. We've talked about collaboration. When I set off in this role, and this was one restructure ago, I was a commissioner, what I didn't want to do is give the design guide to a whole series of urban designers and say, refresh that. What we did is take some really challenging subjects. So I wanted health and well-being addressed. I wanted online technology. I wanted digital and smart technology. I wanted ageing population, which meant that we weren't talking to local authority planners particularly, or local authority urban designers, but we were talking to the people who knew about that. So we talked to people in Cambridgeshire in relation to digital and smart technology, and we had some very helpful people with that process. We specifically targeted people in relation to the NHS and understood what their models of operation and what good practice. We engaged with public health and public health colleagues to really get that health and well-being. And we wanted all of those ingredients built into that. We also engaged with a series of developers. So we had huge amounts of engagement and collaboration, but we wanted to be sense-checking those improvements with the development industry. So we've got people like Countryside. I think Countryside sent a representative to every one of our 30 different meetings. So some interesting statistics here really in relation to 2,615 hours of project management time, the five sort of themes embedded there. The one interesting one, because it talks about 6, the 6th one is actually the product itself. It was an online innovation as opposed to a paper-based system. And now, Peter, I'm going to hand over to Peter, who will take us through effectively some of the examples.
I'm the Built Environment Manager at Place Services, and I'm going to take you through our approach to refreshing the design guide and some of the new stages we've got into it. So these are the things I'll be covering, bringing new areas of work into what traditionally was a residential design guide. So I'll talk you through the updates, how we've fed in public health and well-being, digital smart technologies, and some case studies at the end. I work in a team, the traded team at Essex County Council called Place Services. We're about 45 people. We support around 25 different local authorities within Essex and outside of Essex. So our team's sort of filling that gap of specialist skills within local authorities team, trading capacity. So we certainly work within most of the Essex districts and more wider, further outside of Essex. As Graham said, back in 2016, all the heads of planning of the Essex districts from the represent EPOA decided to commission my team to update the design guide for 2018. But those of you would know, the design guide has its roots many decades ago. I don't know if anyone can guess the year of this. There's Sunderland winning the FA Cup, Flares and Dark Side of the Moon, so it's 1973. So those 1973, so that's nearly 50 years ago. Obviously, me and Graham spoke at the Planning Officers Society about a month ago, and we met a guy who got into planning because he was inspired by this design guide version. We thought it was really interesting to see that the following of the design guide, the legacy of how we use it today, really stands through. And we've even had visitors from Japan come to talk to us around the design guide, wanting to see how the design guides had a positive effect on developments. But whiz forward nearly 50 years, it obviously needs to evolve. This is a snippet from the 1973 design guide. This just shows the scale of the document. This is one of the sort of the micro details of overlooking and relationship between street frontage and the pedestrian footway. Then also zooming out, the context of a larger development. I mean, these principles, this is why the design guide was so forward-thinking, was that we still use these principles today to inform what is a good urban design layout, and why the document was such a pioneering document in the 70s was that it still holds true today. Obviously, fast forward a number of decades, the document was updated in 1997, and the latest version was 2005. We spoke at the 35th anniversary case we mentioned already today. This is Richard Simmons, who was the chief exec. We had a sort of a birthday, sort of 35th year anniversary of it in London, and there's some really nice sound bites he said there about guaranteeing that Essex will remain Essex, and the last bit, an icon of our times, and there's really good words he had to say about the design guide. And we thought it was really important that rather than let the design guide dwindle out, is that we refreshed it and updated it for the issues that we face today. Obviously, there's so many different issues that maybe weren't so prevalent in 2005. Health and well-being, from obesity to mental health to dementia, all issues that it's difficult to escape from, and they're more and more coming into the planning sector. Creating developments that are fit for all ages, from elderly to young families. And obviously, the avenue, South World, and we use this probably too much, but quality does matter, and I think it's really important to celebrate the best schemes that we have within the county. But it's all about the art of placemaking, shaping, understanding the context of which you're building, and designing development that fits within that. And I think, as Graham alluded to earlier, the original design guide, I think, had its plaudits, but also because the design guide itself started to create this design guide typology, which became a reason to maybe knock the design guide, because it was more akin to maybe the north parts of Essex rather than some of the southern districts. And I think that turned people on and off about using it, and even though there's some really core principles embedded within the design guide, I think local authorities felt like it wasn't really relevant to them, and that's something we really wanted to address in the update. There's Graham talking at the launch in February this year. We had around 150 people turn up, but it was the snowiest day of the year, so we did quite well. But I think since then, there's been we've done a lot of promotion on the document and the guide, and there's some really good feedback that we've had through. So as Graham said, we've turned it into a digital document, enabling it to reach a lot more people. I said to Tom when we arrived today, if I would have got a 5,000 print version of the hard copy of the design guide with the new MPPF coming out, they would have been skipped immediately. So being able to adapt and change the design guide, picking up all the new issues that we're faced with today, keep it relevant, keep it on message, and keep as many people using it as possible. So within the design guide, there's lots of familiar stuff. I think we were really important not to completely change the principles within the design guide itself. I think there's lots of things that people use. Certainly when we're dealing with volume house builders, that we use the design guide as a tool to suggest alternative ways of dealing with some typical scenarios that you might find. So there's lots of familiar stuff in there. Being online, I think it's been mentioned already about the fact that a design guide document, I think, is aimed at technical practitioners, like probably everyone in this room, but I think involving the community from different all ages, from parish councils, neighbour planning committees, for them to be able to access a tool that's written in a way that they can understand what the principles are will really inform them and empower them to make their decisions about how their communities grow and shape. Again, it's been already mentioned, but a great piece of research by the Urban Design Group and Place Alliance about how under-resourced local authorities are specifically around design skills in their current teams. These charts show that the grey columns are the areas where no local authorities have designers, landscape architects, and architects. 80% of local authorities don't have an architect in-house, and I think using this design guide as a tool to help enable planning officers, case officers, certainly in the DM teams, to upskill them and help them make some decision making around the applications that they have to address. So it's kind of a go-to document to be able to search through and understand. But the heart of it all, and it's been said already today many times, is about addressing the context. So if you're working in Braintree or Basildon, Harlow or Castle Point, it's about the context. So the document is front-loaded to about addressing the context you're building, be it the built-in context, historic context, functional or social context. And within the design guide, being online, we've been able to have each of the different districts and boroughs within Essex will have a page, or they have got a page which sets out all of their current adopted documents, whether they've got their own design guide like Thurrock and Harlow, any adopted SPDs they've got, so you can immediately go to that page and understand what the context is that you're working to. So some of the new themes we've fed in, Asian population. We had conversations with Design Council CABE and a number of other national bodies, sort of feeding what the national thinking is around this, so we can get this topic embedded within the design guide. All the new themes will have got a page on the website that introduces you to these new sections, but rather than having isolated sections of these new texts, we've embedded it all the way through the design guide. So as part of the update process, we employed a copywriter to go through the text of the design guide and make it web ready, but also making sure that all the themes and principles within, say, Asian population is embedded through the existing document. So by, in essence, using the document itself, you'll be ticking a lot of the boxes around how to tackle and design for an Asian population. Similarly, around health and well-being, we've had many sessions with Public Health England and the NHS and some of the CCGs around how people engage with the health sector, but also factoring some of the principles that they have within their, how to get consultation in through them and engage with them. When we're doing the update, this is a structure of its time where you can see it's really complicated how to actually get advice from the NHS or some of the CCGs around what's expected out of a development in terms of the public health provision, and certainly through the estates and design team. We wanted to show users on the new design guide website how to contact the right people. I think this structure has changed already. I think it was changed when we write it, but I think being online gives us that opportunity to update it and refresh it, so people can have a conversation with the person they need to get to understand the information they need, certainly around the health. We've embedded in Sporting England's 10 active design principles, again using the national best practice rather than rewording it for an Essex context. Certainly in terms of these principles, they should apply everywhere, and I think we've tried to embed it throughout, not just in the principles themselves, but certainly in terms of best practice case studies. And again, thinking about how the design guide can maybe change the development sector going forward, starting to make them think about cars, car usage, how developments are connected, pushing the sector to start thinking around how places are going to evolve with digital and smart technology. And certainly the homes we're building on some of the large developments, the first phase will be an awful lot different from the last phase. And I think in terms of principles and nudges, we really wanted to push the development industry to start thinking about this. I think previously we may have made mistakes around looking at technology and saying, suggesting certain technology options to go for. And I think this is more about asking the question, how things are going to evolve and change, and maybe expecting them to see how they can foresee car usage, for one thing, changing over the years. Graham mentioned our conversations with BRE. We had lots of meetings with them about embedding the housing quality measures within the design guide. This is a little chart around, I think, column on certainly on the left here, shows the themes within the design guide, and then the other column shows all of the quality measures that they'd use through the HQM. It dovetails quite nicely, and I think as we've evolved our sort of Charter for Growth programme, the adoption of the HQM within the development industry in Essex, I think, will certainly see that a lot of the stuff they're already doing with the design guide can be used again to avoid double counting and making sure that it's easier for developers to sort of decide if they want to do an HQM scheme, they can fit it around using the design guide as well. So the other updates, we've embedded the MPPF throughout the design guide, and obviously with the new version coming out, we'll do the same for that. Being online is the benefits around us to allow us that to happen. We've got an awful lot of information on there. It's like a resource hub of historical, natural and built environment context documents and guidance that has been available, but it's been sort of hidden in a really massive kind of council website. So if you go into the new design guide, there's an awful lot of resource library you can use to reference some of the new development you're working on. As I've mentioned already, there's a district, borough and county pages. So you can see the policies and the adopted policies in place already to make it easier for you when you start looking at a site to understand what parameters are in place. There's an updated highway standards. We've got our highways colleagues on that, and that's still an evolving piece of work, certainly evolving how highways and some of the adoption processes work, and trying to avoid the dumbing down of the highways and the adoptable highways. We've got sections of garden communities. We've got new case studies, which I mentioned in a minute, and we've got an FAQ, which basically the website becomes a suite of easy accessible guidance, policies and reference documents, and you can get in contact with somebody if you get stuck to ask them for some help. So I mentioned case studies. I love looking at this picture because it really dates the car in there. You never see those anymore on the road, but the fact that we want to really promote the best practice in Essex, and I think some of the Forest examples were fantastic, and I'd like to see all of those within the case study page within the design guide. What we've tried to do is showcase the best practice in Essex, not just in terms of design and architecture, but also health and well-being, ageing population, and how the new themes have been designed around some worked examples so we can showcase best practice. So we have currently a Newhall, Harlow, Beaulieu, the Avenue at South Morden, as I already showed you. And then some sort of more vernacular ones. I think it's just trying to demonstrate that there's a context and a design for all different parts of Essex, not just necessarily focusing on what traditionally a design guide would be around something more similar to this. And what next? Well, EPOA manages a steering group, so any changes within the website, the governance is owned by EPOA. So Graham's currently the chair of that. So there's a review process that we're currently going to go through for any updates. And then any subsequent updates to that will go through the EPOA group to agree and sign off so that we can control how the content grows and evolves. We're always up for new case studies, so feel free to email me any examples that you know that we can put on there and showcase the best practice within Essex, or if it's a best practice scheme that covers any of the other themes, it doesn't necessarily have to be within the county. We're rolling out member and officer training to understand how to use the design guide. I recently spoke to a Basildon committee, and for the first time, they endorsed the design guide, and they're going to use it as material consideration for referring to all of their applications now. I think that just goes to show how the track change of what the design guide was when we started in 2005, because they didn't really see any relevance to them. Now they see it as a useful tool to help determine some of the applications they've got. And also you can register online to receive the updates. So when the MPPF gets published, we'll be updating the design guide, and there'll be a new section on that. So if you register, you could receive emails to tell you how the document's changed and gone forward. So check it out. There's the website, essexdesignguide.co.uk. There's my email address, and there's the email address for the design guide team as well. So if you need any questions or want to get in contact, feel free to drop me an email. Thanks.
Well, thank you both very much. That sounds like a fantastic tool to arm authorities to be able to make informed decisions when they're reviewing applications. I was interested to see with the stakeholders that you'd engaged with, there didn't seem to be a huge number of architects involved, but obviously there were developers involved. How do you feel about working with architects? Sort of an open-ended question there, but you know, do you think that there's a case to be made for architects to be having a more active role in engaging with authorities to aid that in informing of members in making decisions?
So yes, we positively welcome that, and as Pete said, we're going to be commissioning the next phase of where we take the design guide. So at the moment the design guide is very much residential based. So actually, what is the answer in terms of good placemaking in terms of the businesses? So there's a whole string of additional areas that we want to grow in the design guide. There's going to be no reason why, if there's not an interest from the RIBA or I don't know, the university, to engage with that process. So I will engage Pete to sort of manage the collaboration process. So we'd quite welcome that. So if there's people who are here that are interested in wanting to take that forward, we'd welcome them. So I know Andy was very, very helpfully contributing to the first phase, although you were very busy with Grenfell. So, but we appreciated that. So, absolutely.
Yeah, I was working with an architect yesterday actually on the next phase of Newhall, PRP Architects in Bellway. And it's interesting that working with architects, they take on board ideas and suggestions. It's more about refinement. Whereas when you work, a lot of volume house builders use the design guide as more of a resource to push them to achieve that uplift in quality. So certainly in terms of the housing numbers we get, I'm told by Bellway they build about 1,000 homes in Essex a year. That's where the housing numbers are going to come from, the volume house builders. And I think certainly most of the people, lots of architects have signed up to registered on the design guide. So always happy to work with architects.
That's good to hear. Are there any questions? Oh, sea of hands have gone up. We start with the gentleman.
Just tying the two presentations together, there was a lovely example of sustainable urban design in one of the Thurrock case studies. So I wondered, and that's actually a classic case of where collaboration can succeed or fail, you know, integrating landscape architecture and highway design to achieve you know, green drainage. So does the Essex Design Guide include advice on how to achieve that, and how is that practically done in schemes within your area?
Yep, so the last version of the Design Guide 2005 didn't actually include anything about sustainable urban drainage at all. I don't think it was a thing then, 2005. The example, the case study on there, which is Beauty, who have been around there, they've got some really good examples of integrated SUDs. There is guidance on there about sustainable urban drainage systems, but there's still issues around adoption, highways adoptability, the mixture between what's adoptable highways and what's adoptable SUDs. We're having conversations about the general approach to adoptable highways in Essex with the highways team. We're bringing in the urban design group as well to push more manual streets than maybe DB32, which I think a lot of the highways engineers still refer to. So there's an ongoing piece of work. I think when we updated this, we knew that we wouldn't be able to solve everything in one go, and I think highways comes up quite often. I think the use of design precedents, so Beauty have managed to produce something that's better than I've seen in a long time, certainly in the current market in terms of what's adoptable. I always point that as a precedent for people to follow, because if they can adopt it in Chelmsford, then they should be able to adopt it throughout the rest of Essex.
And just one point in terms of where we go in the future. One of the things that I do want resolved is what are the different palette of materials that can challenge the tarmac blacktop as the go-to option. Working again with the building research establishment, what can we find out in terms of variability of palette of materials that gives us good value for money? So if a highway engineering solution is we've got this in terms of adoptability, just broadening that so we've got a range of things that we could go to. So that's going to be one of the next stages of where we take this.
Great. There are another couple of hands up. Go to the gentleman there.
Thank you. I think the important theme seems to be engagement, as far as I can see, with regard to how we engage with the ordinary public in understanding what planning is about. And one of the things that kind of interest me was with regard to material considerations, where understanding what those material considerations, not just, you know, for let's say lay people like myself who are going to be making decisions on planning, but also for the general public to actually understand the impact of how decisions are actually brought about by committees. And I think that creates so many difficulties when they don't understand the constraints that we are often under in the way we have to make decisions. So I wonder if there's any help forthcoming within the guide, so it could be a frontispiece of actually understanding what is material and what is not material.
Yeah, I did a seminar last year about, it was mainly to neighbourhood planning committees and parish councils about how to write responses in terms of a new development in their area. A lot of it's from the heart, maybe not so much about policies like you've said. So if people can access the design guide online rather than sort of having to ring up somebody to get them, send them a hard copy that's 15 or 10 years out of date, they can actually upskill themselves and access this and learn it. And I think, yeah, there's loads of work to be done around community engagement and certainly going to meet people and showing them it. But certainly the way that it's written online, I mean, our copywriter went through all of the design guide and rewrote it in more layman's terms so you can understand what it's saying rather than some of the sort of jargon that we use day to day. But yeah, lots of work still to be done on that, I think.
It's in two parts, Ned, really. One is around, as you start working with communities and start doing quality builds and that, yeah, what levels of accessibility in that are you incorporating within that? Are you using the inclusive design, standards and that, or is it basic design part in that sort of stuff, 8300, because that implicates on what the actual end up going to be. The other thing is around the actual design guide. I love the idea of it being online, but then it automatically puts up barriers for some people unless the actual accessibility is actually built into the website. Often what I end up getting, I do a lot of stuff on accessibility ICT, and they get, oh, it's compatible with JAWS, it's compatible with Supernova, it's compatible with so-and-so, which are £800 bits of software, which is great for me, but for the general public and that, they can't afford that. So it's got to be built into the website rather than actually being reliant on people having access to technology.
Yes, on that second part, I think what we did, people were conscious about actually using the design guide if you're writing a committee report or you're using it as a developer to sort of showcase what you've done. There's downloadable PDFs. I know it's not exactly what you said, but I think we could do something like that in terms of embedding some of the technology now that actually would read it to you and
So as soon as you do PDFs though, that don't screen with this generally don't work, there's an image document.
Oh no, it can be a vector. You can do a vector PDF as well. Yeah, we could do that, and that's something we could look at. But there's each of the sections has a downloadable PDF, and there's definitely something we can look at for that. In terms of accessibility and generally, I think because we've got obviously the local planning authority pages, so there's 14 different local planning authority sections. I think we've showcased what they use in determining their own applications within those pages. Certainly, I think it's within each of the districts and boroughs' own policies, which would flag up at that point. But if it's not, we can certainly add it on there.
I noticed you have the NHS there, and I appreciate that to date you're talking about residential development, but in my experience, talking to the NHS, the kind of flavour of it is a bit like, we think that healthy places is a really great thing that you should be doing. And my pushback with the NHS is always, but what are you doing about it? And I wonder whether, if there is the scope if you move a bit out of just house design towards other building design, whether there can be anything about working with the NHS in future around how they are going to provide health services, especially where you're talking about fairly big new communities, which some of the ones you've quoted are. How are they going to cite new models of care, which can be less capital intensive than in the past? So we're not always, it's not always a begging bowl about let's build a huge building. Actually, care can be delivered in a whole series of interesting ways, but certainly care doesn't need to be where people are and not require them to get in the car and drive 30 minutes to find either a hospital or a GP surgery.
So interestingly, the earlier piece of work, the growth and infrastructure framework, we had a huge amount of NHS resources in there. And there's a whole section within that in terms of talking about what the health infrastructure looks like, because there's an expectation, probably a lot of planning officers, a lot of developers are all expecting, a health centre, a GP practice. And actually there's a sort of an element in there that it's changing. You're not going to be seeing necessarily bits of kit, but it's how we use flexible spaces and bearing in mind the challenges the NHS have got in terms of recruiting GPs, nurses, etc., etc. So there's an earlier piece of work that we did in relation to that growth and infrastructure has probably helped us inform the design guide itself in terms of health and well-being. But there is an expectation that it's old-fashioned bits of kit, whereas it actually is completely changing. We're not going to get bits of kit all over the place.
But also it's about how the perception of local communities about a new development will impact on school places and how long they're going to wait to see a GP. I think having that engagement with the NHS and how now that structure is probably out of date already. We need to probably think about how it works, but people need to think about those health services will be delivered in a completely different way. What does it mean in terms of how big a community do you need? A 5,000 home community to resource an extra GP? Well, you better find the GPs to go in it. So I think there's a perception that any new development will bring its own, but it's unlikely. It will just support an existing GP surgery and maybe give them some money rather than actually deliver anything. So they've got an awful lot of work to do with that as well. I think linking it up with the design guide for the first time is the first step, but this will evolve going forward.
Finally, Andy.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting, and I'm very supportive of it, as you know. I just wondered whether there was sort of some issues that could be expanded on, and I was thinking specifically about the continuity from planning to building, and the dumbing down issue, and when you get planning consent, the pressure to then make it sort of value engineer it to make it work, and whether there's some sort of signage that you could put in the design guide that suggested to developers what would be the best way to avoid that and to deal with that particular problem.
So I think that's a really good question, Andy. So I think this comes back to the two schools of what we're trying to do. So there is a relationship piece of work with planning protocol, viability, because we know collectively that there are a range of developers. We know there are a range of intermediaries and master builders, and viability and the challenge in terms of value engineering is a very, very real one, certainly within Essex. So we need to address the quality agenda as well as that relationship agenda. And ultimately, in terms of, if you like, addressing viability, we'll have an SPD. So we're following the London model and where the London Mayor is going in terms of that, but also in relation to helping with that development management process, having the quality charter and probably the quality panel to support. So if I think back of my time in Cambridgeshire, you wouldn't take a planning application to a planning committee without having been through the quality panel, because members there would have expected that. And I think that's where we need to be moving to support the DM process, to support members, to push back on that value engineering and produce quality products. So I think both of those, relationship and quality, need to be progressed at the same time.
Great, well, thank you both very much. That's an excellent way to finish the